Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. Now, there are a lot of videos out there that are about character arcs, building character. I love those kinds of videos, those kinds of classes, those kinds of craft books. But there's an issue that is not as often talked about that is what I wanted to address in this video. Does your story have a big cast of characters that you need to keep track of? Then this is for you. I want to help you troubleshoot some of the common issues that arise when you do have a larger cast of characters. It can be fantastic to have a big cast. Think about Lord of the Rings or Ocean's 11, or even my Tanyuman Academy series has a really big cast of characters. So what are some issues? How can you fix them? And, how can you make the most of all of these characters, make them memorable and individual? So one of the things that can happen when you have a big cast is white room syndrome. So say there's a meeting, there's a family meeting or something, you have 7 people in a room. You're so focused on letting people kind of have their say and getting the dialogue and the reactions in that it can feel like it's just disembodied heads that are talking to each other, rather than being grounded in a setting with imagery and that kind of thing. So make sure that there's still a sense of place around your large cast. Otherwise, we aren't going to feel grounded. We're just going to be, it's almost going to be like a play that is not actually being put on, but you're just reading, which is often not a great idea. So if you have this problem, then try this. Imagine that you have 3 characters who are having a conversation in a literal white room, just to make things kind of interesting, and make sure that they all have some, chance to speak, but have them interact with their environment. Maybe have somebody sit down on the couch or something like that, without pausing the action and the dialogue to just describe that white room. Give snippets of imagery, which is sensory description, or interactions with that room. So it'll give you some good practice if you do tend to fall into that white room syndrome. Okay, another issue that sometimes happens with big casts is that the important characters get lost in the shuffle. So who is the protagonist? Every story should have some main, a main character or main characters that are very clearly delineated. We know whose story this is, and it's not everybody's story. Everybody might have their own, arc and thing going on. Hopefully they are treated as real people. Secondary characters, that is, but we need to know who we're following and who we should care about and whose head we're in as we're going through this experience of, this army or this family or this whatever it might be that causes the cast to be so big. So it should be easy to figure out who we're supposed to focus on. And if we're introduced to multiple people at once, it can be easy to kind of let that slide, but it's important that you not let that slide. So there are a few ways that you can pretty easily fix this. So if you want to do, the exercises that I'm suggesting to help you out, more power to you. So imagine you take those 3 people from before in the white room. If you haven't already figured out which one is the main character of the scene, the protagonist, then choose which one is the protagonist and then add a clear sense that that is our main character. And ways that you can do that are by adding some thoughts, some feelings, some interior reactions for only one character, adding a goal for that character, but we only see kind of the outside, like what people say and physically do for the other characters, but we really have this inside look at what the feelings, needs, wants, thoughts, desires are for one character. If you haven't watched my video on Deep POV, that also has some really great tips for how to make sure that we know that we are in the head of our protagonist and nobody else. So regardless of how big your cast is, each scene at least should have a standout person that we're really following around. And the story as a whole, we should get a sense of whose story it is, with very rare exceptions. There are exceptions to every, you know, writing rule, but with newer writers especially, what I see is it's unintentional. You know, you have to have a really good reason for breaking away from some of these suggestions that I'm giving you. Okay, another issue with big casts that sometimes comes up is that it seems just like a bunch of clones. People kind of act or look the same way. I'm sure we've all run into this. Maybe there's a friend group in the story, and the friend group, you know, 3 of the people in the friend group are interchangeable with one another. Unless you're really trying to make them interchangeable, like, you know, a set of twins that are like in Lord of the Flies, which has a kind of middle-sized cast. We have the little ones, and then we have the twin, you know. So these people that we can kind of interchange, then great, that's fine. But I'm going to assume that for the most part, if you have a big cast, you want them to not be just interchangeable clones. You want them to be individual. So make sure that your characters are different from one another, even if you do have twins. What is it that differentiates one from another? Is there anything that is unique about the one, either in personality or appearance? It's very hard to remember characters who are too like each other. The chances of people remembering names or things like that will decrease dramatically. So if you want to practice this skill, a simple way to do it is you take those 3 characters in the white room, figure out which 2 are the most alike, and then add some differences. Like, don't pause and give a full description like, well, he was 6'5" and things like that, but instead layer in physical description that differentiates those 2 similar characters, and personality quirks, traits, ways of speaking. Layer those differences in. So we see very clearly that we have this person who is, you know, fearful, this person that is stubborn, this person over here loves animals, this person can't stand animals, this person is, you know, a very large person, this one's a very small person, you know, whatever it may be that differentiates the people. Just consider, how can you differentiate those? Okay, another issue, and I've run up against a lot of these myself, so this is not only what I've observed through my own reading and watching and teaching this, but also what I've run into myself. So another issue is sometimes it's hard to tell how many people are actually in a room. I've gotten the question in one of the, I do webinars sometimes. You can always hop over to my website, carly-stevens.com, if you're interested in a more in-depth, you know, class or course from me. But there, you know, I did one on deep POV, and there was somebody who said, how can I, you know, if this character whose head I'm in is really focused on this other character, then, you know, isn't it normal for me to focus on one character and then kind of turn to somebody else in the room and really lock on to them? Yes, but if I don't know how many people are in this room and I'm just focused on this one other individual, and then all of a sudden, poof, here comes somebody else, it's like a jump scare. Or it's like in The Office when, you know, Michael Scott's having one of those talking heads and then we back up and we see Dwight's been there the whole time. We don't want that. We want to have a big sense of generally who's there, who's in the room. Another way of thinking about this is like in cinematography, in movies. Sometimes they'll start on a small detail or a close-up of a face, and then you have the establishing shot. And the establishing shot is where you get the more wide shot, where you see where people are, what is the room or the skyline or the whatever it is. So we get a sense of like how many people are at this party that's being depicted here, for instance. So anyway, all this to say, it's important that we know approximately at least how many people are in the room at one time, and so it's not like people materialize out of nowhere. So if you're going to practice this, just getting that establishing shot in, think about that scene that you've kind of been building and add a fourth person to the room who doesn't speak early in the scene. It doesn't need to be the first sentence or two, but like early in the scene so we're not taken back. Add a silent fourth person and give them a reason to be there. Is there somebody who's kind of lurking in the doorway? Is there a child of one of the individuals who are there? Is, you know, whatever, however you want to tackle that, but add a fourth person and then make sure, go through it again and check, do we know where everyone is in relation to each other? We don't want this to sound like dry stage directions, but we do want to have a sense of space and where everybody is in the scene. So do this as naturally as you can. So in pieces, you know, have the main character whose head you're in maybe glance over and notice this person and how they're far away from these three others who are standing in a circle in the middle of the room. Something like that. Okay, something else that can happen when you have a large cast in a story is that you might get feedback, I just don't feel connected to these people. That's a fairly common reaction when you have a lot of people that you're introducing, but it's important that you do get an emotional, personal connection to these people. I assume that you as the writer have that kind of connection with these individuals, and that's why you've included a bunch of them. They're important to the story, and you think that they're just great characters who must be included. So you want to make sure that there is that personal connection between the characters and the readers. The readers are going to care so much more about your story if they care about the individuals in it. So some ways to fix that. If you go back to that scene that you've been building on this entire time, check and see if you have these elements. If you don't, add them in and just see how quickly that makes your characters more relatable, more, you know, emotionally connected to whoever's reading it. Do you have a goal for your main character? Do they have a clear goal? Even if it's just like convincing the group of something or getting out of this place or, you know, making a friend or whatever it is the goal clear for your main character? Is there a reference? Can you work in a reference to something unfortunate from their past? You do not need to pause and have a whole flashback. Instead, maybe something reminds them very briefly of, you know, that other time, or they have a stronger reaction than you would expect to something that's kind of simple because of the negative associations with it. Try that. You don't have to do all of these things that I'm listing to make that emotional connection with your reader, but these are options. These are things that you can do if you haven't already to really amp that up. Number 3, does your main character have an emotional reaction that they feel but do not express out loud? They might, you know, from what you've read or written so far, but think about it. Number 4, a reference to somebody that they care about. Have you referenced someone that they care about? Maybe you've chosen some, you know, hard-boiled detective type who just wants to get out of this, you know, family reunion or something, but there's somebody that they care about. Maybe that somebody is a sibling, maybe that somebody is, you know, the family dog, but make sure that you show that protagonist caring about somebody else. And then if all of that still is not quite working, you need the cherry on top, and that is having somebody else in that room, somebody else in that cast presenting an obstacle, or especially putting your protagonist down, insulting them, making some kind of snide remark, really getting in the way of the main character, either you know, emotionally or, you know, in terms of their goal. All right, another issue that sometimes comes up that actually I found to be an issue in If We Were Villains. For a while, it took me a minute to really get into If We Were Villains, because the very first scene, I think, does a decent job of introducing a ton of people at once, but also I would recommend not introducing a ton of people at once. It took me a minute to unravel who was who, because we get, what is it, six principal characters who are all in the same place at the same time in the first scene. So the thing that can happen is that you introduce too many people at once. It's overwhelming. It's hard to remember names. This was actually the reason that I DNF'd one of Victoria Aveyard's books, because in the prologue, the number of names and characters that were introduced was so overwhelming. I just thought, no, it's too difficult. It's too hard to keep everybody straight. I'm sure I would have gotten it eventually, but it was just too much. So what can you do if you have a lot of principal characters? Like If We Were Villains, we have very important characters that do need to be introduced really, really early on in order for us to get that sense of dark academia and this insulated community of these Shakespearean actors. So if you go back to that scene that you've been working on, if you're following along with the exercise, imagine that the scene you've been working on, that scene with the 3 talking people and the 1 extra person in that room, imagine that that is the second scene in a story. Imagine what would the first scene look like if you introduced only 2. So if you think about Lord of the Rings, for example, Lord of the Rings has a really big cast. We have 9 people in the Fellowship. If we were just to be introduced to all 9 at once, it would be a bit much. However, what we get is Bilbo, Frodo in the Shire, and then we get Gandalf, and then we get Sam. It's a slow trickle. We're introduced to these characters little by little for the most part. Aragorn gets his own few chapters where we're really focused on him. So which 2 characters would feature in that first scene? Who is most important to introduce first? And think, what would that scene be about? How could you establish what's about to happen in that next scene with more people in it? There are ways to make your characters memorable too. Let's say you want to introduce more than 2 at once. You really want to say, hey, here's a bunch of people. Think about Ocean's 11. We have a lot of introductions right in a row, but we can differentiate them all effortlessly because the filmmakers have made very memorable entrances for these characters. Some ways that you can do that. So try to spread out name introductions so they don't all happen at once. What I have done, if I have a few characters to introduce, is I'll name the more important ones, and the others can just be like a description until they become more important and we're really established with the names of these characters. So in Kingdoms on Fire, for example, the last book in the Tenured Academy series, I wanted to re-establish this large cast in the first few chapters. You know, where are we? Who are all of these people? So there's already a lot of names in the mix, ones that people have seen before, but still, it might have been a while since people pause between books sometimes. So I didn't want to throw in like 4 additional names until some of that had been worked out. So I have some guards who go with some of the characters for a big part of that story, and they do all get names, but they're just the guard and then maybe a physical description for quite a while, and then we learn who they are, we learn a little bit about their backstories, and at that point people are comfortable with the original names and characters, so they're able to kind of take on that additional piece of information and it's not just all plumped on them at once. Something else, try not to have their names be too visually similar unless you don't mind if they get confused with each other. This is something I need to remind myself of all the time. There are particular types of names that really appeal to me, and so I'll use them. But then I will realize afterwards that they really do look pretty similar. And it doesn't even need to sound similar. They just need to look visually similar. If they're about the same length, if they start and end with the same letter, you have something that looks pretty similar to another name. So to differentiate your characters in a clear way, have the names be separate, be different. Another thing you can do is give each one a very vivid, clear trait when we meet them. Start them off as like, it sounds terrible, start them off as a stereotype, not a stereotype of, you know, like gender or race or, you know, harmful stereotypes. That's not at all what I'm talking about, but more like character types, something that people can say, oh, okay, this is the chatty one, this is the loner, this is the, you know, something that they can say, I remember them, I know who they are. And then as time goes on, you can of course add layers to those characters, but if there's something recognizable and simple about their introduction, then that's going to go a long way. So you could also do not just character types, like, oh, okay, here's the mentor or whatever, or you can give them something unique in their first scene. So they're the one who never put down their phone, and this bothers the protagonist for some reason. That's something that makes that character stand out from all the others. Or this is the person who bragged about eating the world's biggest pile of broccoli. That's going to stand out because who else is going to brag about something like that? So give this recognizable beat, you know, descriptor to each character as they're introduced, especially if they're introduced all at once. I think this is a lot less important if you're spreading them out. You can, you know, be a little more laissez-faire about it. But if you have 6 characters in a room on a couch like you do with ML Rio's If We Were Villains, then you have to give them a descriptor that people can hang on to. The way she does it is she typecasts them as the type of Shakespearean character they always get cast as. This person's the villain. This person is the wide-eyed innocent. This is the... We find out that that's not 100% true about them as people, but it gives us something to go, oh, okay, yes, I know who that is. Okay, and then just a hodgepodge of additional questions that you can kind of ask yourself. How are you doing with big casts and group scenes? Ask yourself, first of all, how many of these characters are actually important to the story? This one's a little bit painful, but is this person going to further the plot in some way? Are they going to further the character arc for your protagonist? Are they going to have an important role in, you know, in some fashion? If the answer is no, if you can't really come up with a good reason to have that person there except, oh, well, I just figured they came from a big family. I mean, consider cutting down the number of characters to just the ones that really are going to feature and be important. Something else is when you have a lot of people, it's easy to lose a bit of clarity in who's acting, who's speaking. So making sure to use a lot of names and dialogue tags that people can just gloss over with their eyes. You know, we don't think about, she said, it just is kind of this subconscious thing, but it kind of oils the wheels of reading and understanding and not having to ever like look back and check to see, wait, who is that? What's going on? So if there's the chance that there could be some misunderstanding, just add the tag, just add the name. And, you know, as you're going back and editing, you can see if any of that sounds clunky or weird. Something else that I sometimes see with a big group scene is head hopping. This is a pretty common term in the author community for when the action and thought and focus has all been on one character. You have your protagonist, right? The story is being told through their eyes. But then we learn what somebody else is thinking, and we kind of come back. Like, they were suspicious of Dave. I mean, how do we know? We're not in that person's head. So as much as possible, try not to go from having a limited point of view, which most writers want these days, and for good reason, to something that's briefly omniscient and then comes back. It really takes us out of the action. It's not very tight writing. Only people who are really boss level experts can pull this off with any success. So I would advise against it. I avoid it at all costs, even though I've read books where it has been done well. Even in those, sometimes I'll raise an eyebrow and be like, okay, I'll let it go, you know, person whose work is in like the canon of literature. And then the last one is some shoehorned descriptions, because we want to differentiate these people quickly, because we want to be able to visualize, you know, the tall versus the short versus the, you know, the hair, the whatever. What I'll see sometimes is, especially at the beginning of a story, an awkward pause to give this description of the look, the outfit, whatever, and then maybe people continue talking, and then we pause for this long description of the look, the outfit, whatever. And it's if you do that, the writing becomes kind of clunky. So my recommendation anyway is try to shorten some of those descriptions. It's important that we do have a sense of what people look like so we can just visualize the scene. But shorten those descriptions and then kind of add in layers if people are like, you know, pushing their dark hair behind their ears or things like that. It can clue us in as readers to fill in some of the rest of that outline without pausing and giving a full description. Unless your point of view character is really like checking somebody out or noticing that there's you know, this is not the clothes that they typically wear, or, you know, they're preparing to be a hairdresser and so they notice just everybody's haircuts, then maybe don't pause every time to give us like the almost voiceover feeling descriptions. All right, I hope that was helpful. The Tanyuan Academy series omnibus, so that's all 3 novels in one, which is about 1,500 pages, is now on pre-order in paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. The paperback and hardcover in particular are just stunning. They are gorgeous. Oh, and ebook too. If you were going to get all 3 books, this is going to be a much cheaper option. And it's beautiful, so there's no downside. That is coming out October 1st, 2024. So yeah, please pre-order. Let me know what you think about the series. And with that, like this video if you like it. Subscribe for more writing, publishing, and indie author life. And I'll see you next time. Bye.